Hello, everyone. My name is Timothy Jones. I'm an Associate Professor of History at La Trobe University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this launch of the queer voices in the works of Richard Krafft, Richard from KrafftEbing. Douglas has innovated, I think, a really lovely international book launch style where we have the traditional launch and response, but then also some actors will be reading some of the text for us. And then following that, there'll be some time for questions if anybody has any. As is our custom of respect in Australia, I will formally open by acknowledging that we are meeting in Australia on Aboriginal land, that sovereignty was never ceded, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. It's a delight to have Professor Katie Sutton, who I didn't realize was a professor, which is very exciting, here to launch the book. Katie's an expert in German history and the history of sexuality, and I'm really looking forward to hearing her words. Katie.
Thanks very much, Tim, and not quite professor, associate professor, but I appreciate the temporary promotion. And thank you very much for the introduction. And I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country up here in the ACT. And I'm really honoured to be able to say a few introductory words about this fantastic new critical edition by Douglas Pretsell with translations by Michael Lombardi-Nash, who's also joining us here today, as I understand, at 4 a.m. As the title suggests, the book really highlights the queer case studies of pioneering sexologist and psychiatrist Richard von Krafft-Ebing. Impressively, I would note, completed also in the midst of the pandemic, the book rather than the case studies. And as Pretsell shows in his beautifully clear and insightful introduction, there's a certain tension at play in this book. And I think we can also see this in the beautifully or the carefully chosen title. So on the one hand, we have Krafft-Ebing himself, who's writing and publishing from a position of privilege as a cishet white male doctor who had access to the highest levels of university training, someone who enjoyed positions of authority in universities and prominent Austrian psychiatric clinics. And on the other hand, we have the voices of the queer subjects that are made available through his works, most famously, but not only, the 1886 study, Psychopathia Sexualis. These were stories of queer lives that Krafft-Ebing had variously collected in the clinic, sometimes prompted from his patients in psychiatric asylums, or in many cases was sent without explicit prompting, especially by gay men who saw themselves reflected in his writings on sexual nonconformity and so-called pathology. Krafft-Ebing, as Pretsell carefully shows, oversaw this process of making queer voices and lives visible with a degree of sympathy and care that was quite unusual among doctors and psychiatrists of this era. Seen by many in an emerging queer or earning community as what Pretsell aptly describes as, quote, an ally in the earning cause, unquote, Krafft-Ebing made a significant contribution to shifting attitudes about sexual nonconformity from a more moralizing to a more medicalizing framework, with sexuality increasingly viewed as located in the brain. And Pretsell also really usefully highlights the strong influence of early gay legal reformer Karl Heinrich Ulrichs on both Krafft-Ebing, but also on his queer patients. And I note that the translated correspondence of Ulrichs has also been made recently available by Pretsell and Lombardi-Nash in a 2020 publication. But there were also important differences between these two men. Ulrichs insisted on the rights of so-called earnings as a matter of natural law, at a time when most male same-sex acts were criminalized in Germany and both male and female homosexuality were outlawed in Austria. Krafft-Ebing was sympathetic to such legal arguments, but nonetheless insisted, at least for most of his career, on framing same-sex desire through the lens of pathology, although Pretsell also shows how he did come around to a non-pathologizing standpoint at the in his very final years. But it's first and foremost the voices of Krafft-Ebing's queer patients and correspondence that this new edition foregrounds. The story specifically of 41 individuals who variously identified with new late 19th century labels, such as earnings, contrasexuals, increasingly also as homosexuals, and sometimes not with any labels, and who today might or might not consider themselves gay, bisexual, queer, or trans. Many of these stories were by individuals who had been inspired by Ulrich's arguments for legal reform, and who looked now to Krafft-Ebing as a sympathetic figure, someone to whom they could tell their life stories in the name of science. What I particularly value about Pretzell's introduction is the way that he sorts and reflects on the different ways in which they went about this, and really highlights the agency that they displayed in doing so. He shows, for example, that while many gay men wrote to Krafft-Ebing of their own volition, many of the women and trans men whose stories Krafft-Ebing published had written these down only under prompting in quite clinical settings. Some of these queer writers also challenged Krafft-Ebing's pathologizing attitude, and Pretsell dubs this group the dissenters, even as he points out, and I think really carefully, that Krafft-Ebing chose to let these narratives stand in his works in ways that create a productive ambivalence in the texts. And as a result, we gain access to some of the more diverse ways in which queer people of this era saw themselves. So some were seeking treatment or cure, but others were very happy with their lives and celebrated their queerness. As one civil servant declared, "I cannot find the love for men pathological," while another autobiographer describes how discovering their queerness had led to a significant improvement in their well-being. And I quote, "Since I let my earning nature run free, I am happier, healthier, and more efficient." Pretsell rightly points to the strong similarities between such affirmations of sexual experience and desire and the later 20th century genre of the coming out story, with both serving as really crucial foundations for negotiating sexual identities and sexual politics in the history of modernity. And I also wanted to note that beyond this book too, Douglas's work is making crucial inroads into some of the lesser known areas of queer German studies and history. And I wanted to point to the words of recently deceased and dearly missed colleague Robert Dean Tobin, who wrote, quote, "Pretzell's work will find resonance throughout the world." I know that we're about to hear more of these queer voices that Douglas Pretsell highlights in this new critical edition during this launch. So on that note, and I hope that I've kept my introduction brief enough, I'll pass back to Douglas. I congratulate you most warmly on this wonderful publication. Thank you for producing such a wonderful resource for the history of gender and sexuality and the history of 19th century Germany as well. Congratulations.
Thank you, Associate Professor Sutton. I'm sorry for promoting you. I genuinely had made that mistake. Sorry about that. Thank you for your very, very kind words, which are deeply appreciated. Before we proceed with the readings from the book, I would like to acknowledge several people. First, Michael Lombardi-Nash, who checked all of my translations before publication. This is the second book that we've worked on together. And once again, his meticulous attention for detail and tireless commitment to bringing the voices of the queer German 19th century to life are deeply appreciated. I would also like to acknowledge the support of my supervisors, Tim Jones, who is chairing this event, and Liz Connor, and the La Trobe History Department in general. Camille Nurka, who copy-edited the whole book, was a total joy to work with, and I couldn't recommend her high enough to anyone producing books or papers that need a copy editor. And finally, the whole team at Palgrave Macmillan. Thank you all. The most remarkable thing about these autobiographic case studies is that they gave a platform to real men and women to talk about their sexual and gendered selves. I felt, therefore, that the most appropriate readings from the book should be taken from the translations of the autobiographies themselves, rather than my introduction. In the book, I sorted the autobiographic case studies into 9 categories. The following readings are taken from 4 of these: the dissenters, for the good of science, the women, and gender nonconformity. Possibly the most eye-catching case studies in Krafft-Ebing's works are the ones that openly challenged his pathologizing conclusions. These are the case studies that I've characterized as coming from dissenters. In the main, these were autobiographies written by same-sex attracted men who had been inspired by Heinrich Ulrichs and who called themselves Earnings. The following excerpt is taken from the autobiography of Mr. X, an independently wealthy 48-year-old scientific writer who wrote to KrafftEbing in 1884.
I spent my youthful manhood in a futile struggle against myself and my nature. It was not until I was about 30 years of age that I came across the writings of Neumo, and I cannot describe what a relief it was for me to learn that there were many other men who were just as sexually inclined as I was, and that what I felt sexually was not an aberration, but a special sexual disposition inherent in me by nature. For the first time, I experienced the pleasure of finding sexual satisfaction through direct contact with a man's body. I no longer tried in vain to fight against a deeply implanted disposition. And since I have given my earning nature freer rein, I am happier, healthier, and more efficient.
In that reading, Neumo, that was referred to, is Heinrich Ulrichs. Neumo was the pseudonym he used in his writing. Some of the men who wrote their sexual life stories to KrafftEbing claimed to do so for the good of science. Several of these were medically qualified men who saw the value in KrafftEbing's work. The following reading comes from a letter sent by a lovesick country doctor.
I made a formal covenant of love with a 34-year-old businessman. We lived like man and wife. X wanted to play the man, and I came to love him more and more. I was at his beck and call, but he had to let me be a man now and then. Over time, I got tired of him, was unfaithful to him, and he became jealous. There were terrible scenes, temporary reconciliation, and finally a definite breakup. The merchant later became insane and ended his life by suicide. I made many acquaintances, loved the most vulgar people. I preferred those who were full-bearded, tall, middle-aged, and who were good at playing active roles. I became a doctor and went to a provincial town and had to live like a nun. I was inclined to move around in women's society and came to be seen with pleasure there because they found that I was not as one-sided as most men and was interested in toiletries and other such ladies' conversation. However, I felt very unhappy and lonely. Fortunately, I met a man in this town who felt the same way as I did, a sister. He provided for me for some time. When he had to leave, I went through a period of despair with gloom and even suicidal thoughts. Since I couldn't stand it in the small town, I went to the big city as a military doctor. There I revived, often making 2 or 3 acquaintances a day. I never loved boys or young people, only real men. That's how I escaped the claws of the police. The thought of falling into the hands of the police was horrible to me. Nevertheless, it could not prevent me from satisfying my urges. After a few months, I fell in love with the 40-year-old officer. I remained faithful to him for a year. We lived like lovers. I came to be the wife and was literally pampered by my lover. One day I was appointed to a small town. We were disconsolate. The last night was a constant kissing and caressing.
The next excerpts are taken from autobiographic case studies written by women. Women's sexuality was still a relatively undeveloped subject in the psychiatric literature, and unlike the men, there were no women sending KrafftEbing unsolicited autobiographies. All of the case studies of women came from the clinic, where many of them were undergoing therapeutic interventions at the behest of family or the authorities. Unusually, lesbianism was illegal in Austria. KrafftEbing persuaded some of the women in the clinic to write about their sexuality, and the passages of autobiography from these women are fragmentary, short, and there will be 2 readings from this. The first excerpt comes from the account of a 26-year-old maidservant with the initials CR. This woman dabbled in cross-dressing for employment purposes and wrote this account of her evolving sexuality in 1889.
One judges me incorrectly if one believes that I feel like a man towards the female sex. Rather, I behave as a woman in my entire thinking and feeling. After all, I loved my cousin as only a woman can love a man. The change in my feelings came about because in Pest, disguised as a man, I had the opportunity to observe my cousin. I saw that I had been badly mistaken about him. This caused me terrible anguish. I knew that I would never be able to love a man again, that I belonged to those who love only once. In addition, I had to listen to the most disgusting conversations and visit the most disreputable houses in the company of my colleagues from the railway. The insights I gained into the goings-on of the male world gave me an insurmountable aversion to men. But since I am, by nature, very passionate and have the need to attach myself to a beloved person and give myself completely to her, I felt more and more powerfully attracted to women. And girls I liked, especially those distinguished by intelligence.
The second excerpt comes from an account written by a bourgeois young city woman called Miss X in 1898. She was a 22-year-old who intended to pursue a career on the stage. She relates the story of her seduction in a hotel room.
One day, she led me to her divan, and while she sat down, I let myself slide to her feet. She fixed her shy eyes on me, brushed the hair from my forehead and said, "Oh, if only I could love you so properly for once. May I?" I said yes, and as we sat there, gazing into each other's eyes, we slid over into the current where there is no turning back. It was captivatingly beautiful. If only I could have painted a picture to immortalize these manifestations. For me, all this was new and intoxicating. One gave oneself up, fully and completely. Uninhibited in the most ardent in the most ardent intoxication of female sensuality. I do not think that a man ever matches the enchanting intoxication, the delicate and piquant. Men are not refined enough, not sensitive enough. Our wild game had lasted until I sank back, exhausted, powerless, enervated.
A small number of KrafftEbing's autobiographic case studies came from men and women whose lives were ordered by their cross-gender identification rather than sexual orientation. This is in a period before the term transgender and its associated concepts had been articulated, and it would probably be correct to call these individuals gender non-conformists or proto-trans, men and women with a strong sense of their gender of identification, but no name, category, or identity to call on. This account comes from the 1890 autobiography of a 22-year-old medical student with a strong sense of his gendered self.
My tendencies. The abnormal tendency just mentioned is the basic principle in my sexual feelings. When I dress in female clothing, I feel complete satisfaction. I am overcome by a peculiar sense of calm and well-being that allows me to engage in lighter mental activity. My libido for sexual intercourse is extremely low. I also have a great sense and taste for female handicrafts and have been able to acquire crochet and embroidery without any instruction, and I enjoy practicing these skills in secret. I also enjoy other female tasks such as sewing and so on, so much that even at home, when I keep my inclination completely hidden and guard against practicing it, I have often earned the praise of being a good parlour maid through spontaneous activities, a praise of which I am not at all ashamed, but which, on the contrary, fills me with a secret pride. As soon as I was able to think for myself to some extent, and I was concerned with the difference between the sexes, it was my secret and firm wish to be a girl. I even believed I was one. I tried to destroy my sex glands by gradual pressure, but the pain soon made me desist. I still yearned for the outward signs of the female sex, a pretty plait, a round breast, a slender waist. At the age of 12, I had my first opportunity to put on female clothing, and soon in the evenings I began to drape the bedclothes, sheets, and so on in the style of female skirts. Later, when I came of age, it was my greatest delight to secretly put on my sister's clothes, even if for a few minutes, under the constant danger of discovery. To my delight, I was later allowed to take on a female role in a lover's play, and I am said to have performed my part quite well.
That concludes the readings from my book. I'd just like to thank Lillian Hudson and M. Chandler for doing these readings with us today.
Thank you, Douglas, and thank you, Em and Lillian and Katie for such a touching introduction to this book. Katie, you provided such a rich sort of contextualization of everything, but it was really quite startlingly intimate hearing the letters read by Lillian and Em. We have some time now if any people in the audience have any questions or want to raise any things, either to Douglas, Katie, Lillian, Em, or Michael, who's the translator who's joined us. So if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat or the Q&A, and I will address them to people on the panel. So somebody has asked, why didn't women send autobiographical letters to KrafftEbing? Where do you think that was, Douglas? And perhaps Michael and Katie might hop in as well if they have thoughts.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, but I think it's one that has to be seen the other way around. Why did men send these case studies to KrafftEbing? The reason they did is because they'd had, 20 years of doing this with Heinrich Ulrichs and having their letters published in his books. And Ulrichs had promoted KrafftEbing as someone they should be following. So they were sending the autobiographies to him. At that time, there was no direct connection between gay women and gay men. Particularly the Austrian women who were involved here were probably, if they were politically active, were more likely to be active in feminist circles than in areas of sexual campaigning. That came later. And they possibly didn't have a very positive view of psychiatry, given the way psychiatrists had been treating women for many years.
Yeah, it's interesting, the marked difference between the way that men spoke for themselves at that time and have less evidence of women having that same kind of counter discourse or original discourse about sexual identity.
Yep.
Two more questions have come in. One is a comment, really. Katarina Garcia Walsh says, congratulations on this excellent and exciting publication, Douglas. She's very much looking forward to reading it. Elena has asked, KrafftEbing was one of the first to describe sexual fetishism. Do you have any thoughts on fetishism that you would like to share in the context, I presume?
So my focus has been specifically on the case studies that KrafftEbing labelled as contrasexual. And I would guess there's probably less evidence of the fetishism within them. That being said, there is one of the psychic hermaphrodites, that was the word that KrafftEbing used to describe people who were bisexual. There was one of them who was a foot fetishist, who was turned on by boots and less turned on by gender. So he was sometimes turned on by women's boots and sometimes turned on by men's boots. There was also one of the earning case studies where it bordered on what you would call hebephilia, the love of teenagers, which is a bit. It's not something that KrafftEbing highlighted or wrote about much, but to modern sense, it can be quite confronting reading it.
Thank you. Graham Willett has asked if you have a sense of whether, in a general sense, the correspondents mostly found confirmation of their existing desires, or if their sexual identity was shaped by their reading and, I presume, engagement with Ulrichs and KrafftEbing.
I think it's a bit of both. You do see evidence before Ulrich starts writing that there are individuals who can describe their sexuality. There's a famous letter that was sent to Johann Ludwig Caspar, and there are other examples throughout history. But what I think happened when Walrus started writing his pamphlets is it changed the way sexuality was thought of and organized. It brought one's sexual orientation to the very front of one's identity in a way that hadn't been done before. And you only have to look at the letters that people sent to Ulrichs to see how transformative that was on their lives. And you see that also in some of the case studies, the dissenting case studies that were sent to KrafftEbing.
I have a question, and this is for both you, Douglas, and for Michael. I know that you found each other through your love of 19th century German sexology, but I wonder what captured your imagination by this period and these writers that you've been working on together.
I'm going to give Michael the opportunity to answer this first because he has a much better story than me, but then I'll give mine.
About how did it come about? The love for it? I was a student at the University of California, and I'd just come back from Germany. And I went to the library to look up books on homosexuality, and I found an original by Ulrichs. And I was fascinated just by looking at it. It was beautifully printed, for one. And it was about Urningsliebe, but I didn't know what that meant. And it was by Neumann Numantius or Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, because both names were on the title. Didn't know what that was. And the title was Gladius Furens in Latin, and I didn't know what that meant either. But after a while I found out, and when I began to read it, I was fascinated, and I was reading it to my lover, Paul Nash, and I was stuttering because I didn't know the terminology or anything, but it was fascinating because it was activism and sexology mixed together. And Paul just said, translate the thing and I'll read it. And then I went to historians in Los Angeles, and they told me he was important, Ulrichs was important. And just out of the blue, people started sending me the German versions of Ulrichs' writings, and I continued and haven't stopped even today. Still working on Ulrichs.
So my story is a bit more recent. In 2008, I attended the installation of a Maybaum, that's a maypole, in the Karl-Heinrich Ulrichsplatz in Munich. And this was to be a gay maypole. It's a very Bavarian thing. I was living in Munich at the time. It was the day after I met my husband. So I was probably very happy that day. And I just didn't know who Karl-Heinrich Ulrichs was. So I looked it up, and I fairly soon after that, I made contact with Michael through the website, and we had occasional emails over the years that followed until I was made redundant a few years ago and decided I would go back and do a PhD. My focus has been less on Ulrichs and more on the men who called themselves Urnings, the people who read Ulrichs' books and then acted on that and then described themselves in public as Urnings.
We have one question, and this might be the last question unless anybody is urgent and sneaks one into the Q&A immediately. Matthias asks, to what degree did von Krafft-Ebing analyze sexualities in terms of nature and natural dispositions, or rather in terms of social and political constructions? Was von Krafft-Ebing in debate with Krafft-Ebing as well?
I genuinely don't know whether he was in contact with Krafft-Ebing. So I'll answer that bit first. He did have some contact with Jaeger, who had collaborated with Krafft-Ebing, but by the time Krafft-Ebing was publishing in this area, Krafft-Ebing had had a stroke and was living in Hungary and died very soon before that. So I don't think they had any meaningful interaction. In terms of the way Krafft-Ebing saw sexuality, I think you have to see that in terms of the way he and many other psychiatrists at the time co-opted the theories of Ulrichs. Now, Ulrichs very specifically made a claim, a natural biological claim, that sexual identity was caused by an embryological switch between the male and the female, so that you had the sexual identity of a woman inside a man. He had a famous couplet that was Anima Mulebris. Sorry, I can't remember the way it goes, but the idea was that it was a woman's soul in a male body, although actually that's not quite what Ulrichs was saying. So to come back, Krafft-Ebing pretty much adopted Ulrichs' ideas. He used the word contrasexual, which is a psychiatric reflection of that same term, and he saw these things as brain-based and as he made a distinction between those he saw that were fully Urning, fully homosexual. He believed that they had a fixed nature from birth, and those he classified as psychic hermaphrodites, who he believed had been circumstantially influenced to be same-sex attracted. And he believed those ones, the psychic hermaphrodites, could be amenable to therapy. I hope that rather convoluted answer answers your question. Maybe Katie might want to comment on this as well.
I mean, I thought that was a quite clear answer, but I suppose just that Krafft-Ebing was coming at it from very much a medicalizing and pathologizing framework, as opposed to either a natural law or a political framework. And I think Krafft-Ebing, you know, we're really associating with those political tracks in the Hungarian context, and so I think he was in some ways more in debate with Ulrichs, and I believe there might have been some correspondence with Westphal as well in psychiatry. But I think I see Krafft-Ebing as someone who's more ensconced in the psychiatric and medical world, but with that keen interest, as your introduction draws out, in legal reform as well, and also how Krafft-Ebing's own family history played in a little bit into that sort of legal reform passion, even though he chose to follow that via a medical path.
It's interesting that Krafft-Ebing did start off with that pathologizing position, which he's revised later on. It would be a mistake, though, to see that all of psychiatry in Germany followed Krafft-Ebing. That wasn't the case at all. There were a lot of psychiatrists, particularly forensic psychiatrists, who were very critical of KrafftEbing. And what you see after when KrafftEbing dies in 1901, the legacy that he left is really with sexology and not with psychiatry. So the psychiatrists who took over the writing of the editing of Psychopathia Sexualis after his death were very much more hostile to contrasexuality, whereas Hirschfeld, Havelock Ellis, Bloch, and others, and Moll took a much more positive line, following in the KrafftEbing path.
Well, there are no more questions, so just congratulations coming through from the audience. So thank you all again for coming to listen to this beautiful launch. Thank you, Katie, for your words, and Michael for your presence and support, and especially to Lillian and Em for your beautiful performance, bringing this collection to life. And so we'll wrap up at this point. Thank you, everyone.